Who are you these days? Do you still like strawberry acai? Yeah. Who are you these days? Who are you these days? You used to tell me about everything. Who are you these days?
What's up, you guys? It's John, and it has been an extremely long time. I have been on a bit of a hiatus, but that's okay because today we have a video for you guys, how to make a beat. Now this tutorial is going to be focused on how I put together the instrumental for the song you just heard in the intro to this video. And I'm really going to try and talk a lot about what decisions I make when putting my instrumentation together, what tools I choose to use, and what brings me to those conclusions. I really want this video to focus on the artistic design choices behind how I put my beats together. And then, of course, if you guys do have any more technical questions, please, by all means, leave them in the comments. I am more than happy to go in depth in another video on those things. But when it comes to like how I design a specific synth in terms of numbers, or what kind of math I do when I'm adjusting frequencies, those are topics that really I can end up getting off into a tangent indefinitely on, trying to explain the decision-making process and the theory behind how certain things work. So I'm just gonna keep it simple today and really try and focus you guys in on what I do in the process of creating a beat from song to song. So jumping right into it, this beat is made up of 4 different sections. We have our drums, which we have 5 tracks for. We have our bass, which we have 1. We have 2 guitars, and then we have a Vox synth, as well as a standard synth stab at the bottom here. And then these last 2 tracks are just something I put together to create a transition for this part. You heard how that kind of sounded like it was swelling into the next part of the song. So that's what these 2 tracks are. And I will be going into that towards the end on how I put that together. But to start off, let's take a look at these 5 drum tracks. Now, if you have been reading the names of my tracks as I've been talking, you've probably already noticed these are loops. I definitely think it is perfectly fine to use loops. Some of my songs in my earlier days are almost entirely made of loops. And although I don't do that anymore really, because it's not the process that I find most comfortable at this point, since I tend to be very nitpicky about what something sounds like, loops just don't really do it for me. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. I'm super happy with how those songs turned out that I use loops on, and I really love a lot of music that people have made using almost exclusively loops. I still tend to stick to loops pretty strongly when it comes to drums for a couple of reasons. One, I think they sound the best. When it comes to either the digital instruments or trying to session in real drums or using loops, loops generally come stock with the best audio already. I don't really have to do a whole lot that could stress Garageband out to make them sound better, like I tend to do with my melodic instrumentation, which brings me to the second reason I tend to use drum loops a lot. It stops Garageband from freaking out. If I'm trying to plug all these things with digital instruments and I'm trying to get them to the audio quality that I have these drum loops at, a lot of times what I end up doing is putting so many plugins on my drums that before I even get to my instrumentation, Garageband is already slowing down. So again, highly recommend loops, particularly with drums. So this is a pretty solid example of what most of the music that I've been making for the past year or so realistically look like. So to start off, we have our kick here. So this is the Bhangra Glow Beat 3 loop. And if you don't know how to get to a loop, you just hit this button up next to the microphone on the top left that looks like a grid, and that'll take you into your loop tracks. You can see here I have actually a lot more loops in here than I actually ended up using. I tend to experiment with a lot of things to make sure I'm getting exactly the sound I want, but you hit this plus button down on the bottom left and you hit loops, and then that will bring you into the actual loop listing, and then you can adjust based on instrument genres or descriptions. You can even search for a specific loop if you have one in mind already and you know the name of it. And honestly, whenever I'm putting together my drums, this is what I'm generally doing. I will go through here and I will find the kick that I want, the snare that I want, and whatever, toppers, shakers, hi-hats, anything like that. And I will just sort of splice them together into the actual beat that I'm looking for. So that's the kick by itself. If we go into the plugins and EQ, I'm really not doing a lot. This effect EQ tends to not pretty much do anything. So I kind of just leave it there. I don't really mess with it. If I turn it on or off, it doesn't really change how the track sounds almost at all. So we can see here in the visual EQ, I actually kind of killed the bass on this kick, ironically, for two reasons. One, if I were to turn off this EQ and then we play this kick, you can hear it's just really boomy. This is actually meant to be more of a dance house style of kick. And so I kill the bass to remove that boominess and turn this really into more of like the lo-fi kick that I wanted. And then I boost it in the mid just to get a snappier sound out of it. And that's pretty much all I'm doing with my kick. From there, I have a very classic snare sound. Kind of clappy, not a whole lot of body in that snare, but that's okay because that again goes into the lo-fi sound that I wanted. I didn't really mess with the EQ at all on this one, so that was the ethereal disco snare loop. The thing that really puts this beat together though is these three toppers that I put together here. If I were to play, for instance, the kick and snare by themselves, you're just getting a standard, which is cool, it works, but it's very boring in my mind. So I put these three together to try and kind of give it that contemporary sound that you hear in a lot of two-step beats like this, where you have a couple of different sounds almost hitting right next to each other instead of on top of each other. And it just gives it a more organic sounding tone that almost sounds like there's a real drummer playing. So if I were to play the toppers on top of the kick and snare, it sounds a lot more believable that way. So what I'm doing here is I took the diamond needle topper, which sounds like this, as well as the deep down quirky topper, which unlike the diamond needle, I didn't actually leave alone. If I copy this and paste it in here and then kind of stretch it out a bit, there's actually a lot more to this topper than what I'm using. So yeah, that's its own beat entirely. But what I did was I took all of that apart and used only an explicit few sounds that I thought would really complement the kind of hip-hoppy groove beat that I was going for. So yeah, very simple. This is really just accenting the beat. So even though there's not a whole lot going on with it, it actually kind of sounds a little empty without it. If I were to play just, you can probably already tell it sounds like something was missing there. Yeah, so that just helps fill it out a bit to make it sound more like it's a final beat. And then lastly, I add in a shaker. After that, the next thing I put together is the bass. Now, bass tone, as most artists are, I am very particular about, and sadly in GarageBand, you don't have the most amazing list of options in the world. The stock basses are good if you're going for something funky or hip-hoppy, but in all reality, you're never with the stock basses on GarageBand going to get the quality of sound that you can achieve in an actual high-end studio because of the number of tools that most digital basses have that the stock ones just don't. So this is a bass plugin that I purchased off of the iTunes store called iFretless Bass, and I love this bass to death. In terms of acoustic sounding bass, this is just the most amazing tool. If I actually open it up, you can see here, it looks a lot like the stock basses in GarageBand, but if I hold down on this gear on the bottom right, you can see we have a lot more settings at our disposal. We have our entire own EQ available to us. We have several different options for controlling the velocity and the style of note. The instrument tab here is actually a preset where you can choose from a number of different types of basses, some of which are even synth. So you really get a robust collection of controls here to help get you exactly the kind of bass sound that you want. For this song in particular, I was going for something kind of John Bellion-y, Charlie Puth-ish. So I wanted a really funky, slappy sounding bass. So this is what that sounds like isolated. So you heard some of those notes really sound like they're actually snapping and like being popped like an authentic bass guitar. And that's exactly why this app stands out to me so much, is if I click on the velocity option here, I can choose exactly how much that happens. So if I were to like maybe bring this all the way down to where it's barely audible, you could barely hear that it was still in there, and then you can make it sound like a standard note. Or you could really make it just... So yeah, in terms of acoustic bass guitar sounds on GarageBand, this is absolutely the gold standard in my mind, and I highly recommend it. That being said, as far as apps go, this one is a tad expensive at $15, and I didn't actually have this app for most of my career as a musician. I only got it, really I want to say right before creating this song, but to be honest, it was getting this app that made me feel like making a song like this was possible. So if you're ever going for this kind of contemporary funk pop sound, this is where I would set the gold standard at, is iFretless bass. Moving on from there, like I said before, I have two guitars on this track. If we were to isolate them together, that's just a nice ambient rhythm, and then on top of that we have the lead. So a nice little like almost Spanish guitar sounding lead track. So how I made these, for those of you who know me, you probably know very well, I do not use actual studio microphones in my process. And I have videos going in depth on how I go about this, but all of my recordings are actually made using a pair of either Apple earbuds or the onboard microphone in my iPhone 8 itself. So the Apple earbuds were actually what I used to record this track in particular. Basically what I do is I hang my microphone in the earbuds over a chair, and then I'm usually just sitting on the floor playing my guitar with the microphone as close to the strings as possible, so I can still get that pick sound and get the full tone and have it just sounding really up front. As far as plugins, I'm doing kind of a lot here. You see I have voice rack effects on this guitar, which is usually something I use on my vocals. I just have that in there to widen out the track, and that's so I can get a nice panned left and right guitar without having to make additional tracks. Again, it's just, for those of you who have seen my optimizing performance video, this is one of those things that I talk about that I do a lot to try and avoid adding additional tracks that can cause GarageBand to slow down more. From there, I have my parametric EQ, which is just nice and scooped in the middle to pull out those mids. I have my compressor that I'm mostly using for the noise gate, but I also do have a little bit of actual compression going on. And then I have my favorite reverb ever, Black Hole. This really makes the entire sound of this guitar all by itself. If I were to mute this plugin, here's what we've got. Right, so the entire, like, it almost sounds like the body of the guitar itself is coming just from that reverb. This reverb is super powerful, and it's very robust. It gives you a lot of options for controlling the dynamic of the reverb. It also comes with a lot of presets that all sound really amazing by themselves, and you'll actually see on a later track that we're going to talk about in this song, I'm using a pretty interesting preset on this reverb. So we'll talk a bit more about this in a second. But the last thing I want to talk about on this track is, you probably heard when I played this dry just now that there was kind of a hissy sibilance happening every time I played a note on the guitar. And that was actually a complete accident. This is something I think a lot of musicians do, where they record something and then something happened during the recording and they didn't mean to do that, but it sounded great, so they kept it. That little hissing noise actually just sounded amazing to me because of the way the beat comes together with the bass and just everything that I had already intentionally made with the desire for, like, again, like a lo-fi hip-hop kind of John Bellion-y sound. That actually just helped fill out the space and even complements like the shakers and the toppers a little bit, and it came out sounding like this. Right, so it definitely doesn't offend the track at all, so I decided to just leave it that way, even though on the next guitar track I definitely didn't do that. If I were to isolate this guitar, you can hear there still is a little bit of background noise just because I pulled the threshold up a little bit on my noise gate to still get that lo-fi sound, but it's definitely nothing as egregious as what I had on that first track. So this one's a lot more simple. Still the same parametric EQ setting, mostly the same settings on my compressor, with the exception of a lighter touch on the noise gate. And then I'm using the stock EQ to kind of help support what I was doing with the parametric EQ even more. And that's really it for guitars. Moving on from there, this is one of the more interesting tracks on this song. If we listen to this by itself, you probably heard it kind of in the background. It almost sounded like a Flume style sort of vocal synth. So what that literally is, if we take away Black Hole entirely makes that track. We'll also take off the vocal transformer just so you can hear what I was actually singing.
Yo, these days, strawberry acai.
So that's literally tracks from the vocals in the final version of the song that I plugged in to the instrumentation, and first, I vocal transformed it using the stock vocal transformer app just to give it that higher octave sound. And then this is the preset I was talking about before on Black Hole. It's called Nebula, and basically what it does to a track is it just adds so much delay. It almost sounds like the track is playing in reverse. Makes things very spacey, very atmospheric, and anytime that I need to add that to my song, I can almost guarantee you that I am using that preset of Black Hole reverb. So other than that, I also, of course, have my auto tuner on, have my pitch correction on, just to keep everything nice and cut and dry. And then I am doing a little bit of work on the stock EQ here as well. The goal with this EQ was really to try and actually make the track sound a bit more muddy, because I was intending to have it a bit lower in volume than most of the other things going on. And so I wanted it to have a tiny little bit of that boomy, airy nature to just help give it a bit more atmosphere. And then after that, we have our last track, which is utilizing one of my favorite GarageBand synths in existence. This is called Zeon. Those of you who know my channel have heard me talk about it before. This is using a preset called Tri-Stab. So the track sounds like this. And if I save a preset of this, I'll actually go in and kind of talk a little bit of what I did with this one. So if I were to use the default Tri-Stab, you'll notice it actually sounds a bit different. So that's kind of why I wanted to go into it. This actually utilizes the frequency knobs that come with Zeon a lot and puts them, you can see on the top left, this one is default set at 7 semitones, this one set at 0, this one set at -3, this one set at 7 again. So we have a lot of harmonies happening here that cause the chord that Tri-Stab creates to not really complement anything that I was trying to do. So I actually set all of these to their respective octaves to just kind of make everything sound more like it was one note. And then from there, you go into panel 2 on the left. This is where you can control the effects table for Zeon. Basically for this, I go into poly. That way you can play more than one note and it will address them as chords instead of the note bending. I left the delay alone. It's default on, and it's actually a big part of how the sound works on this track. And I also left the reverb on. I even added to the reverb by putting in the stock reverb and just giving it a little bit more ambience. And that's actually pretty much all I did with this. The filter and drive I did mess with a little bit, but that's kind of what I was talking about where I said going into the weeds. I kind of did mess with a little bit just for tonal purposes, but I don't really want to get into the weeds with all that. And then with the envelope, I mostly left this alone. The attack and release are all I would have wanted to mess with, but they were pretty much already where I wanted them. So from there, it was just a matter of putting the chord progression together. So I plugged in all the notes I wanted to. And once I had done the work of setting everything exactly where I wanted, that's how we get this. So everything from there was just me making artistic decisions that of course you might not make the same decisions on in your song. So again, I'm not going to get into the weeds with all that, but that's pretty much it. That is the entire track as you heard it before. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is what I mentioned before about this little transitionary piece right here. This is actually using the same vocal synth that I was talking about earlier, this guy here. And then it's also using another drum loop. It's the Long Cymbal Crash 3. This is one that I use in almost every single one of my songs whenever I'm doing a transition where I need a swell of any kind. It's almost always this exact cymbal. So I have this swelling in. And then I also have my vocal doing the exact same thing. So you can hear both of those are swelling, and the way I did that, for anyone who isn't familiar with how to do automation on Garageband, if you actually click on the track on the left side of the screen, you'll get this list of options coming up. You click the automation option, and this will actually pull up an automation window. Now you can only automate volume in Garageband, and that is one of the biggest limitations of this app that truly I hope they change at some point, but until then, a lot of the things that I choose to do that are maybe weird or unorthodox are in the name of getting certain sound effects out of my instruments that you otherwise don't really get without the ability to automate frequencies or other things that you can't automate in GarageBand. So using the automation options available to me, all you do is you flip this little switch on the top left, and then if you click on the automation wire, you can just add a knee pretty much anywhere you want. You can delete it by hitting it again, and then you're just controlling the volume for that specific section. So for this swell effect, I have the instrument completely muted, and then I bring it up almost to max volume and then kill it again right as the transition stops. And that was how I got this to sound like this. And really there's a lot of different things you can do with just that alone, depending on how big and atmospheric you want your swell to be, but that was really all I wanted, given the leveling that I have volume-wise on pretty much everything in this song. So that is it. That is how I made the beat for my upcoming track, Strawberry Acai. I will definitely be posting a link right about now in this video when that song is released, so you guys can definitely check it out and tell me what you think. Once again, if you guys do have any questions at all, and you want details on the more mechanical side of what I did with putting together this song, please leave comments below on what you want to see in an upcoming video, and I will be more than happy to create more tutorials for you guys. I do have a lot of new music on the way as well that I'm really looking forward to bringing you guys, possibly even a new music video. So definitely hit like and subscribe if you want to see more tutorial content like this, or you just like the music and you want to be there when it drops. Until then, as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and peace out, you guys.